What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Audiophiles Podcast.
Now, I'm Malik, one of your co-hosts, and I'm joined here today with Knox, one of the smartest experts in the business music field there is. We were so lucky to have Thomas Brunet, the composer for Chants of Sennaar,
Which we covered back in episode 2.
Oh yeah, just a few weeks ago. It was so great to have him on.
We replied to his comment, and we said, do you want to talk about your work on the show a bit? And we're so excited to show it with you. This is the first episode of the new Audiophiles series, Composer Spotlight. We're going to talk about their process, we're going to talk about their work, but we're also crucially going to get to know them as a person, direct from the horse's mouth themselves. We still use that analogy, by the way? Horse's mouth? I feel like I mixed up a metaphor there.
No, horses don't talk anymore. We get to hear a lot about his process creating the music, his inspirations, his guidelines in the creation of the music, but we also get a more behind the scenes look at how he gets the job, how he looks at the music business as a whole, what are some of the technical barriers and some of the technical advantages involved in being a game composer today.
Like we said, this is a follow-up to episode 2, Chants of Sennaar. We did a track-by-track analysis.
When we played it, we found it to be a straightforward, simple, but very deep in its singular mechanic of solving puzzles by deducing a foreign language in the game. We really hope you enjoy this really special episode of the Audiophiles where we put the spotlight on the composer.
Welcome for our first Composer Spotlight, Mr. Thomas Brunet.
This perspective is really important. We sure have a lot to gain from talking about music in games. A lot of people ask questions because they generally don't know what we're doing. And I think it's fascinating to have a platform to explore this. And we're talking hours and hours of soundtracks sometimes, so years of research, and there's a lot to unpack.
Interesting to me, though, that you use the word research there.
There's a lot of research involved. Although the brief I received was so precise in a way that the research was made easy by the fact that Julien and Thomas, the developers, really knew what they were doing and what they wanted from the start. So there was, as you know, 5 different groups in this tower, which all have had their different specific cultures. Everything in the game derives from these cultures, like the puzzles, the languages, the glyphs, the music, instruments. So I guess the research was then a question of how do we invent something that would sound like what these cultures would come up with in a musical sense, and also sound like it's been there for thousands of years. And then obviously follow the instructions, very precise instructions.
Right.
Although I never felt restrained by the developers or the brief or anything like that. It was very, very comfortable for me.
I'd love to learn more about that brief that you got.
We really wanted to give each level its own character and its own sound. Also underscore in the sense that sometimes you get this little suspenseful, almost sound designy kind of pads. And as you noted, sometimes the music doesn't really use themes or melodies or anything like that. It's more like motives that appear, disappear, and reappear. It's basically like some kind of great textile that just was ripped at some point in time. And then you can recognize the pattern that was formed before the rip happened. So this is what we went for, basically using a different color palette for each of these levels, and then try to make them as coherent as possible. Because
when you say a color palette, are you talking about, obviously each level has a distinct visual color palette, but there's also a distinct musical color palette?
Exactly, yeah. Color could be what you would say the first people from in English.
The devotees?
More religious ones. Devotees, yeah.
Yes.
Devotees use way more string instruments and almost nothing else. You could hear the same motive played on the strings and on the flutes, depending on which level you are, but the color is different, like the musical color. It's useful because we wanted to express that these people used to know each other and talk to each other, and they cannot anymore. They can't understand each other anymore.
So you were consciously trying to portray the main theme of this game through the score.
Yes, like what I think music should do. That's a grand statement, but what music could do in the best circumstances is to say something that the rest of the game couldn't really say, because you don't want to say it outright, because the basis of the game is you have to use your own observational skills and skills of deductions to understand the world, because nothing is explained to you. So a lot of things are explained through puzzles and even the shape of the glyphs. But then the overarching story of this tower and these people, you could observe the sculptures on the wall and get a sense of this. But then the music comes and confirms it. Although it's I guess it's mostly subconscious at this point. You don't really click that, oh my God, this is the same motif as the devotees used so these people used to be linked. I don't think you would make this kind of deductions unless you were clearly a musician or looking for this in the music. But I think it is felt more than observed, I guess.
So what is that process like?
Well, what I did was ask the developers outright what's our resource budget involving, assets.
Right.
What kind of musician can you animate? What kind of instruments can you put in the world? So,
and when you're talking budget, just to be clear, we're talking in game dev budget. We're talking about resources being computing power, not money here. And right.
Also production capabilities, because there were like basically 3 people did the entire visual part of the game, and most of it was Julien, which was my direct, how do you say it? He was my boss in terms of musical compositions.
So, sorry to sidebar on this for a second, but I wanted to know, how did you come to get this job? How did you get connected with Julien? Are you part of the studio, or is it a contract basis?
So I am a freelancer. I think you would be hard pressed to find a lot of in-house composers. Like I know Riot has some, Bungie used to have a composer, but then the huge majority of us are freelance or have their own production companies or similar systems like that. And what happened to me with Chants of Sennaar is like, it never happens. Basically, they found me on Twitter and they saw a post, and that's to say the importance of when you're an independent artist like that trying to find work, the importance of showing your work online and also communicating, being part of the discussion around the area where you live, because that's when you're going to meet people face to face, and that's where relationships happen.
Right.
And everyone knows Williams and Spielberg are doing most of their films together, and the same kind of relationships can be built in games, I guess. And what we did with Run Risk was really, from my point of view, with this kind of relationship where you will want to keep working together as long as possible, and in the best way possible. So they found me on Twitter. They looked at my post and they listened to my music, and they found that I was making very specific different types of music they were looking for. And they had this document, this spreadsheet with all the different musical cues they needed with emotional descriptions.
Wow, so you got a very detailed brief.
Yes.
Which is not always...
No. It was really comfortable, as I said, because Julien is also a musician and he's been artist for decades now, so he knows, and a freelancer, so he knows how to speak with us. I had this insanely detailed brief, and then I had references, and then even if I wanted to kind of break this, I still could do it, and he would say, well, that's not what I thought, but let's keep it. It works. It's nice. It was really an ideal situation.
So you found the team really easy to work with.
Yes. I guess it's also a matter of size. Like 2 people doing the entire game is way less open to confusion and quid pro quo. And, communication in a big team can be a huge part of your time.
Have you worked on some projects with larger teams and experiences?
Now I'm working on a somewhat bigger project. If you want to be as efficient as possible, you need to know, I guess, 2 or 3 people in the team and have them answer your questions, because otherwise you'll just get lost in like digital paperwork and phone calls. But then when you're just working with 2 people and one of them programs the entire game and the other one does 99% of all visuals, it's easy to find answers to question.
So with him programming, I'm curious, what was your role in the implementation of this?
I had none, because they also have a sound designer who was the only one touching the Wise project. And I was like, nice. I just have to write my music.
So what were your deliverables, if you don't mind me asking?
Then sections. Sometimes it's not the most interactive score, so the exports were a lot of basically just loops, and a few action scenes needed a lot more granular thinking, and but we're talking like maybe 3 or 4 cues out of how many? 30?
Wow.
So how much of the game was completed when you got started? Did you get to look at gameplay? Did you get to look at art? What kind of things did you get to behold?
Well, they just signed a contract with Focus Entertainment, the publisher. They had completed half the
And
game.
what year is this?
22.
22, okay.
Yeah. And around March or April 22, they contacted me and they already had half the game done, which is why I guess they had the contract with Focus, because you could see these 2 guys just did half a game and it was already looking very, very well, pretty original, pretty well thought of, and straightforward. They didn't go into 1,000 different mechanics, 1,000 different directions, even if the idea sounds insanely good at some point. And we did this with the music as well, so I'm 100% sure they did this with the whole game, and they looked at their ideas and they said, is this original enough? Is this fun? Is this necessary? I guess if at least 2 out of 3 of these questions were answered by yes, they would keep it. I am pretty sure it was something like that. What we did with the music was ask at the beginning, like, what degree of dynamism do you need in the music? And the first thing we thought was we couldn't afford a very dynamic score, firstly, and secondly, it would be very distracting.
I want to make sure that I'm understanding right. That term dynamism, what does that mean in this context of in-game music?
It means an interactive score. Like basically you do something, the music reacts. And you would do that in great length in, action adventure games or RPGs or, like...
We're talking about when the boss gets down to low health and it adds a new strings line.
Yes.
A new string, right.
That kind of stuff. Yeah. With Sennaar, you have almost no action. You almost never need the music to change rapidly. And if you did that, it would be distracting or annoying or both. We just decided, let's go for a more linear approach, which means most of the tracks have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they will almost never differ from one playthrough to the next.
Now I gotta ask, what, like, as a composer, did you prefer that, or would it make any difference to you if they asked you to chop it up and then you heard it in a million pieces when?
It wouldn't make any difference. It amounts to what is best for the game in the end. And obviously you wouldn't write exactly the same thing if you knew it would be interactive score. But I don't think there are limits to what we can do now with software like Wise and Fmod.
So what differences would you make if they asked for an extremely interactive score? What would you have done differently? Well,
I would have thought out in advance what type of interactive score we needed, because you can easily do a horizontal approach where you skip from one section to the next and transitioning inside the timeline, from section A to section B at a given point, and section A loops until you've reached the transition point. So that would be the horizontal approach. And I guess it's not very different from linear composing. And then you have the vertical approach where layers can appear and disappear. Like you were saying, the boss is 30% life and you have a new string line because it enters phase 2 of the fight or whatever.
Right.
And there's a million other possibilities, like you could choose to EQ some part of the strings if something happened in the game, and you have to take this into account. But if you don't need interactive music, and I guess most games would probably need some level of this, except for puzzle games and really atmospheric stuff. Not as atmospheric, that's not the word. Sennaar is a lot of meditation, basically, and you have to
interesting.
Concentrate as a player on what you're doing. You have to think. Though basically, what you do in this game, you don't have an axe, you don't have a sword, you don't have fireballs. You have your brain, and you have to think to get out of this tower and get up. Like, for instance, when you enter a new zone or go back to the previous zone and the music were to change, every time you do that, firstly, you would have to wait, 1 bar, 2 bars, 2.5 bars for the music to change. And if you do that quickly enough, then it's just a jumble in your ears and you're just going to open the menu and put the music volume to 0. And that's what we wanted to avoid like the plague. We're also obviously gamers, and we've all felt this, where I love this music, it's amazing, but this is now the 80th time I've listened to it and I can't bear it anymore, and I'm just going to cut it. And you feel bad because as a musician, you're like, oh, but there's so much work, and I usually don't.
Right. I find that especially like music in a boss battle, you know, when I'm really frustrated, like I'm already experiencing the emotion of frustration from this boss battle, and then I hear this annoying like intro into the level again. Oh my God, I have to hear this again. Like that's some of the worst.
Unless you're writing the music for Baldur's Gate 3 and you're writing the best boss battle music ever, then maybe refrain from looping it too much. Or we actually had a system in Sennaar to prevent the loops from coming back too often, and there are large silence segments. Like basically every
that was
loop.
something I noticed that I would maybe hear the music when the first time I entered a zone, but then didn't hear it when I came back to it. So that was all intentional. Yeah,
exactly. We had this system where we would think about how long does the player need to stay in one zone, and it's dependent on the number of puzzles and the complexity of puzzles, and also how many times they need to backtrack to complete the game. And we would decide then what the music would do if you would leave the area and come back. And sometimes the music just keeps playing at volume 0. So when you come back, it fades in, and it's not the beginning, it's the middle, because the track kept progressing. Or sometimes.
Wait, so you're saying it's still playing? It's still playing, but it's playing at volume 0.
Well, actually, it just kept into memory. The playhead basically on this file would be the same spot when you would come back.
Wow.
And sometimes it just went back to the beginning of the track. We also had a limit on the number of loops you could trigger, because like in the 3rd level, that's where you've already translated 2 languages. So all the mechanics are known to you, and we can just leave you out in the open. And the 3rd level is a really big one, and almost
that's the bards, right?
Yeah, the bards level is a very open one, in contrast to the first 2 levels, which were there were a lot of compartments and a lot of invisible gates that were actually puzzles you need to solve to progress. And level 3, you can explore almost all of it without necessarily solving puzzles or understanding glyphs, which means I
remember finding it a little bit overwhelming when I arrived at that level, and I suddenly I didn't feel as directed.
And that's on purpose. Exactly. Well, the feeling they wanted you to feel was, arriving in a country where you don't understand the language, you don't understand written language, and you have to deduce, okay, this means I need to go left, and I need to ask this guy where I am right now because I need to go there. And this feeling of being lost, it's on purpose.
Well, like several minutes ago, you mentioned, and now we're back to the bard level, so I need to know. You said for budget reasons, technology and money wise, there were some instruments for animation on screen that were off limits, and I gotta know what instruments are harder to animate than others.
I have absolutely no idea because I just asked the devs, what do you have? And they already had up to the 3rd level. And after that, you don't see any characters playing instruments, or they're just assets from the first levels reused. So they had a lute, flutes, and basically when you encounter the lute player in the first level, that's just one instrument. And they already had this character in this animation, so they just directly asked, okay, write something for lute. And I didn't really have to ponder anything. But then with the theater play, we didn't have all the characters on stage, I think. Or maybe they did, but they didn't know if they would be visible or if they would be animated. I don't remember exactly what the questions were, but I remember we had to determine whether or not flute and strings would be kind of on the forefront because you would see them on screen. And it ended up being flutes and violin, which is not on screen, I guess. So yeah, a lot of instruments are not on screen, but you're focused on something else at that moment. So I just said, let's write something nice and see if it looks good, even without seeing the percussions or the violins playing on stage. And because we couldn't really afford animating an entire ensemble, and obviously you don't see
having
fingers,
all synchronized to the music.
You don't see strumming, you don't see fingers. It's not The Last of Us, we didn't have this kind of budget, we didn't capture anything. So
that leads me to what I really want to know as a musician. Who found the musicians? Did they leave that up to you? Did they bring on the musicians themselves? Where'd you guys look? That kind of thing.
It was all up to me. First, I needed a studio because I had a few leads, but I never recorded as many instruments before. It needed to be in a professional studio, not my home studio where I do my own stuff. It is what it is, but this needed a little more. So I visited a few and met with the people there, the people in the studio in Arcachon, Studio du Bassin. I met with Stéphane, who is the owner of the studio, and he was a composer for 15 years already in films, documentaries, and he knew a lot of people. So basically, he introduced me to Sylvain, which is the flautist. How do you? So Sylvain introduced then the entire ensemble because he knew basically everyone. He worked with tons of people. He's a very, very talented flutist, and he's been basically all over the area in the Southwest. I don't think you would find a better musician or a nicer person, actually. Yeah, it was also a very nice human experience,
Did you write all the parts out in MIDI first? What was your process for that? And what did you hand the musicians?
I had to write demos pretty fast for validation, so I did the mock-ups. And then I wrote the sheet music. I had help with this as well, like all the copying, some tracks needed orchestration. So, I had one person help me with this. And then I gave the musicians all the parts, which there's a funny story about this, is we printed out, 150 to 100 pages of sheet music and parts. And we had 2 piles of paper. One had red little dots on them, and the other pile had yellow dots. And the red dots was we absolutely imperatively need to record these, otherwise I'm in trouble.
And was this like in a day session? How long did you
we
have?
had 3 days in total.
3 days in the studio.
2 strings, one for woodwinds, and an extra one for the clarinets and the vocals. And yeah, it was tight. Fortunately, we had like international class musicians, which they went through the red pile like butter. And we didn't even touch the yellow pile because basically there was no time. So a lot of stuff is MIDI in the soundtrack because, that's what it is. And we ended up recording 11 instruments with 6 different musicians. And
Wow.
It was a wild 3 days. It was awesome. I would recommend this to anyone. Just basically sit there and, these sessions, they're a tremendous pleasure because you get to hear your music in a way you would never have imagined. If you give your page to someone who knows what they're doing, it's like, is this even my music anymore? I wrote the notes, I know what's on the page, and it's absolutely marvelous. And then there's yet another class of musician who basically direct the entire session themselves. These people are like machines, not in the sense that they don't have human emotions. They are overflowing with human emotions, but they are machines in the sense that they hear through these pages. I mean, they're not the most complicated music ever, but still, they just sight read it. They have the right emotion, the right feel. First take is good. Let's go to the next take. And they basically just were so used to film music sessions that it was a breeze. Although if you had asked me at that time, I would have said I'm about to crumble into pieces with stress and worry. But now I'm like, yeah, it was awesome.
Would you say it's normal for the composer to get to sit in on these sessions, or were you a lucky few?
I would say I would not understand the composer not wanting to be at these sessions unless they're remote. But then you would still, there's no way you would not want to be there. And you need to be there because you are responsible for the output. It's not the musicians, it's not the engineers. It's you, the composer, that deliver it. At the end of the day, you're responsible for everything. So it's as much a duty as it is a pleasure. And what pleasure? I mean, I would gladly pay to do this again.
That's amazing.
When you were in the studio, were there things that you heard that you were like, this doesn't work? Or were you things that like, oh, I got to add this or anything like that? Or was it exactly the way you were hoping to turn out the first swing?
Most of the takes were really good. Like the first takes were usually really good. And then we recorded strings together. So one violin, one cello, and they were in separate rooms, but they could still hear each other. And they would just sight read one take and then lay down their instrument and say, were you not a little bit low on that E flat at measure 39? And I'm like, what are you doing? I mean, I would understand sight reading perfectly, although it's kind of black magic, but I would understand. I know that you can achieve this with practice and decades of practice. And I would understand listening intently and saying, oh, that E flat measure 39 is too flat. But then doing both at the same time, I was like, man, these people are magicians.
Well, that's so incredible to me, especially because what you were asking them to do was probably more than there was definitely like some extended technique I noticed on some of these instruments. Like the flautist, I don't know what terms you would use, but like the blowing out sound
Well, I didn't. Some of them I wrote down on the page, and the orchestrator helped me with the, how to communicate this on the page to the musician. But other times it was just, as you said, improvised. Like, oh, what about we tried more air in the flute? Sylvain is like a veteran, and he knows when people say more air in the flute, he knows what the technique is, even though, the fact that we had only modern instruments in the studio meant we were kind of not forced. Nothing is mandatory there. It's music, so we do what we want. But we also needed real folks, players, to associate this music with really old age, and it needed to sound ancient. And the way to do it is usually with unusual techniques or extended techniques, which means maybe not using vibrato at all in the strings, or adding more air in the flutes, or singing in such a way. Modern instruments are so perfectly tailored for a pure sound, like the violin, for example, has been refined for centuries to sound, pure and not gritty like a fiddle or a peasant violin. It's an instrument that is supposed to be played in a 25-piece section. And if you add a lot of harmonics, if you add detuning, if you play it like a fiddle, or if you play it any differently, you wouldn't be able to have these huge orchestral sessions because they would not exactly sound right. But we were aiming for the opposite of this, and we wanted the high levels of impurity. Because
how did you do that?
Well, firstly, you can just say, okay, we need traditional music that's not from anywhere in the world. We need it to remain fictional. We need your instrument to sound old. And most musicians would already have inclinations as to how they want to try to make it sound this way. And by doing this, you also allow your music to resonate in a way that wouldn't be possible if you told them, okay, I want this extended technique, and I want this note to sound like this, and I want you to stop here, and I want you to do this and do that. So the first ingredient, I would say, is to let the musicians exercise their craft. They've been waiting for these kind of moments for decades. Experimentation is the key, and trust also. You have to give your baby to someone else. And you still have some level of control, but at some point you're making, I think, a video game or a soundtrack is something that is bigger than one person. You have to, and you don't have to. Nothing's mandatory. But I mean, it would seem to me like a great shame to not have lived through this incredible experience working with a team and with musicians that are like, on my own, I would never have made half of this, because, I'm not a cellist, I'm not a violinist. All these different sensibilities add up. If you have kind of the same vision, it will, I guess, end up being something that people feel is genuine.
What does that authenticity mean to you?
I guess one has to just dive in and take risks, measured risks maybe. Just whatever the length of the leash is that you have with this project. Like, you couldn't write fanfare, you couldn't write metal cue, but you would have a degree of liberty, right? So you need to explore this and try to expand the boundaries of what this freedom is, and just not try to imitate or innovate at any cost. Just try to make what's best for the game.
Can you talk to us a bit about how different studios approach that differently, and at different levels of the industry you go about that differently?
Well, I can't speak for huge teams and huge studios, obviously, but it very much depends whether they want to, or they have the budget to hire several people for the audio. And what I've witnessed is either the person in charge of sound design will also implement the music, because they already implement the sounds. So they are the ones with the most level of expertise, like the highest level of expertise with softwares like Wise and Fmod we use to implement music in games. Composers don't usually have the same level of mastery over these tools, but some of them do, and really well. And so it also happens that you implement your own music frequently, and then you have unicorns who also do everything. And that would be really small teams, because they want the whole package for less money, because they don't have the resources to hire a composer, a sound designer, and so on.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I don't think it matters to the studios if you do everything yourself or if someone else does, as long as everyone is on the same page. Again, if you don't know how game music works, you won't be on the same page.
It is the middle of the show, and you know what that means.
Time for the promo. We'll do the promo. This is our first big step in this channel. We are really, really excited to share with you our first Composer Spotlight episode.
This platform built around elevating video game music is worthwhile. And if you're listening to this right now in the week or even the month that it came out, congratulations on being a part of the movement early.
A lot of big changes on our Patreon. We've got a $3 a month tier.
You get an actual card sent to your email inbox.
And our $5 a month tier is going to get your name read out loud on the show.
That's right, we're calling that our patron tier. You can still be a part of this movement by sharing our shorts on Instagram or TikTok.
And if you still want to stick around, you'll find us on Discord. You can join our Discord server.
All right, let's get back to the show.
I also want to take time to get into you as a composer more. And part of the other goals of this thing we're doing with the audio files is to highlight individual artists, the work that they're doing, and the careers, and tell what I think is some untold stories about what it's like to compose for games. So would you mind just giving us the old, how'd you get into this? What do you want to be doing with your career?
Sure. I started out as a percussionist in mostly orchestral settings, and I branched into guitar and piano later in my life. And I actually had 7 years working as a French literature teacher in high school. And then I decided my teaching days were done and quit my job as a teacher and decided to try my luck as a composer. This was like 2 years prior to being hired by Randisk for Chants of Sennaar. And during this time, I obviously posted a lot of music on internet. It's still there. That helped me a lot to forge my sound, my craft, know how, what kind of music I wanted to be writing. Also, I spend a lot of time learning about marketing and communication, social media, all this kind of stuff. It's something you have to think about when you don't have the client base at all. It's a part of the job that I frowned upon a lot, and I still do sometimes when there's stuff to do and you're going to spend your whole day either writing emails or posting on social media, but it's never actually such a pain to me because I know why I'm doing it, and it never feels forced. So in a way, it's always like I just need to talk about this because if I don't, no one's going to do it. And then I tried basically every social media out there and ended up deducing that Twitter and LinkedIn were probably the two most effective ones for games.
Well, it seems to have worked. I mean, if you said that that's how they found you, right?
Yeah. But then I also cast my net pretty widely and tried Instagram and Facebook, and it never really seemed to click. I guess there's a generational divide between Facebook and Twitter firstly,
No
and then the people don't look for the same things on these sites. And if you don't think about that, and if you just use them blindly, then your efforts it'll basically be a wasted effort. So I kind of stopped communicating on Instagram, or just really episodically. And so yeah, most game devs were on Twitter, and now they're kind of migrating slowly to Blue Sky. But the most effective professional wise is still X, Twitter. And then LinkedIn is great for everything very official, very it's definitely less relaxed than Twitter.
Right.
But still when you get industry connections, usually you want to use LinkedIn.
How do you go about expanding those industry connections, and what are the networking opportunities for you in your career so far that have been really impactful?
I think I've been very lucky with this because Sennaar has had a huge repercussion on my life and my career already. So I've really seldom had to reach out to people and it was usually the other way around. I don't know if I'm right to do this, but I've had already huge opportunities coming my way thanks to both the game and its reception, and also the way I am easily found, I guess, online. If you type Chants of Sennaar soundtrack, if you type my name, you can find me and my music and my basic contacts, and that's basically all you care about. Is people will find an email address or a contact form or a social media link, and they will find online players for your music. And that's the essentials, I guess. And then, connections through LinkedIn come from people I've worked with already recommending me. Very little cold outreach, because I personally despise when people do it to me. And I'm usually flattered, actually, when that happens. But the little pang of who is this and what they want with me? What did I do? And usually we're very many composers online. So much so that you would be hard pressed to find an official job offer for composers in games.
Right.
There's like 1 or 2 each month, and 10,000 people apply almost on the first day. And you're like, this is wasted effort there, right there. It happened that I applied a few times, but then it's just, if people don't recognize you and don't know you from somewhere, and I'm guessing it's the same in entertainment all around, they will most likely go to the person they know or someone recommended by people they know and trust. And it's just human.
That's been my experience as well.
Yeah, I often hear people say, the nepotism and this kind of theories. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but this is not what happens in 99% of the cases, that people just want to work with people they know and trust, or people recommended to them. And
Malik, you probably encounter that too, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. People call you if they like you and know you. And if they don't know you or don't like you, then they don't call you.
Yeah, exactly. And they would probably not answer your call, or would just politely tell you they're not interested. And it's human, I guess. And it's just the fact of our industry that you wouldn't give $50,000 to someone to handle your project if you didn't trust them. So when they contacted me, Randisk, about Chants of Sennaar, when they contracted me, I had to write demos. That's perfectly normal process. But others just don't need demos and are like, when can you start? Tomorrow? Oh, good. Here's your contract, or send me your contract and I will sign it. Sometimes it happens like that.
So you just said something that sparked a question for me, which was, in our industry, what industry do you see yourself being in? To what extent are you in the games industry? To what extent are you in the music industry?
I am very much in the games industry. Regarding marketing, like music marketing, I mostly market myself as a games composer, but I'm a music composer who happens to be a gamer and a lover of games, and very much loves the way his career has taken him deeper and deeper into games. So I'm not saying I wouldn't write music outside of games. It's just the way things happened that I do have a love of games, and I guess I directed my efforts towards game music. But it wasn't a conscious effort of saying I want to be a game composer. I'd say I would have favored this if I had a choice, but then it's very complicated in France to be just a music composer.
Yeah.
Because if you work in films, you have to collect your royalties, what we call droit d'auteur. They're not exactly working the same way as royalties. And it can be a pain for game publishers to talk and to estimate what kind of money they would need to invest in a composer that's in the French PRO, called SACEM. And if you are a member of SACEM, you can work in films, because then you can collect your income, your royalties, because the upfront fees are very small compared to games. And in games, it's the total opposite, if you are a member of SACEM, then publishers and developers will shy away from you. And there's a very long history about this fact. And I know there are contracts between certain publishers like Ubisoft, which are obviously huge, and they can afford to have people in accounting who are paid.
They have accountants and lawyers.
Yes, and there are some heavy calculations to do when you're a huge publisher and you have several composers you have to pay royalties to, as opposed to percentages set by contracts. For instance, as I understand it, American law is very much what you get is what you write down on your contract.
Yes, there's an agreed split.
Yes. In France, the law kind of states that some, like TV, for example, they all pay rights to the PROs.
And
so
just to be clear, we're talking about publishing rights here, not the sound recording rights. Is split up is separately in France as it is in the US?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sound like recording rights will belong to the person paying for the recording. But then
by the way, I'm just curious, as a side note, who owns the masters to Chants?
Rundisk.
Rundisk.
The masters.
Yeah.
Yes. As long as you have a trusting relationship, it doesn't really matter who owns them, because if I wanted to, for example, extend the soundtrack and do a second album with the remaining tracks that are in the game but not on the album, and I had the funds to do it, I just know they would say, oh yeah, do it.
Because so do you retain your publishing?
Nope.
So by that I mean the actual composition copyright. Do you retain that?
Oh yes, yeah. French law is very, very strict about this. Like, it's illegal to sell or otherwise give away your basic rights. Like, no one can say, like, ghostwriting would be totally illegal in France.
Yeah, that's totally different than how we have it set up in the US. Interesting.
Yeah, that's what I meant with the difference between royalties and what we have. So anyway, it's complicated, and people smarter than me have been working on this for at least 10 years now, and it's still ongoing. But yeah, I couldn't easily switch to, say, film score writing because of this legal predicament in France. And if I were to write music for an American film that's been screened all over the world, I would get my fair share and my income, but for the territories of France, it would be a bit of a pickle. Anyway. Wow.
So I love this nitty gritty conversation, because I think that these are the kinds of conversations that we need to be sharing with each other as musicians, as an industry, to kind of help each other out. But also the business of being a composer, that must be a very fine line to walk. And doing all this administration and royalties, as you're saying, and the marketing of it. But how does that ever get in the way of actually working on the art of it?
Well, I'm not gonna lie. At first, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. You kind of learn from your mistakes, and fortunately, I didn't do any rash decisions or big mistakes. But this is, it's a fine line to tread. As you said, you're constantly fighting the urge to just leave it for other people to decide, and that's when possibly your career will not go the way you intend it to, because then anyone can decide for you. So you have to be knowledgeable about laws, and specifically music laws, and how they relate to the games industry, because these two industries I found are very much opposed to one another, at least from where I am in France. I would say the music industry is very attached to their way of thinking and their way of protecting artists. In the games industry, you will find a very software-centric philosophy. In software, in programming, for instance, royalties don't exist, and you wouldn't pay a programmer monthly fee for the exploitation of his work. But then artists, at least in France, musicians are used to it being the other way around. And it can create very deep confusion. I mean, to avoid this kind of confusion and a lot of efforts and a very long procedure to get to the bottom of it. Even French publishers, games publishers would have an easier time hiring a foreign composer.
I'm curious, if you could go back to like yourself when you were starting your career, what advice would you give yourself? What would you say? Hey, make sure look out for this kind of thing.
Look out for people who ostensibly tell you they're your friends, because usually friends don't really need to say that. And I've had a few adventures like this where you don't really need a contract. You don't really think things in advance because, we're doing things old school. I don't know.
We're friends. We're just buddies. Yeah.
Let's do it, man. This kind of discourse is fine if you don't intend to make it your career, because it's also fun to have side projects and just pick up the guitar and jam. But that's not what you want. If you want to make this into your career, you should run away from these people. Never start working without a contract.
That's a great specific piece of advice right there.
Yeah, and one of the things, maybe you'll tell me more and teach me about this, but I think I read something regarding music marketing specifically, where there's a difference, or marketing in general even, there's a difference between the price of something and the value of something. And people will associate the first number you tell them with the value of your work. And then if you say, okay, let's negotiate, let's see if we can't do like less music or less instruments in the music, or have more time, further away deadline, and then reduce the price. People will still associate your work with the first number you give them, which is the value. And my advice would be always give a first number which you think is slightly too much. And you're like, I would be satisfied with like 10% less or 5% less, but let's just be honest with ourselves, and it's a lot of work and it's taxing. And in my case, I would have been inclined to do the opposite, being like, I'm starting out and I'm just a musician, I'm just a composer, and I do what I love. And society also incites you into this vicious circle where you're not really working, right? Because you're not lifting heavy weights, and that's true. On the other hand, you're a highly specialized, highly dedicated professional, and you often work nights and weekend, although I don't do that anymore. But this would also be a great piece of advice to my younger self. Stop working at, 5, 6, 7 p.m. Just stop answering your email, stop answering your Discord, disconnect, and go play a game, go live your life, go play with your kids if you have some. And also weekends, don't answer anything during the weekend. Some stuff, I never took it too far, but if you don't, as someone I love once said, being on your own, being a freelance, and being your own boss often means working for an imbecile. And so from your own mistakes as your boss, and you have to think, okay, I'm my boss. What would my boss say to me, and what would I say to my boss? And then if these two people can find a right compromise, then you're probably on the right track. But don't neglect mental health, don't neglect sleep. Yeah, you see a lot of people being really proud of not sleeping or working late, and I can understand why they would do it. I'm not disparaging people doing it, because I can totally understand the amount of work coming your way, and there's no humanly possible way to do it without hiring an entire new team. So you have to hustle, and it's not by choice, I imagine. But then you also kind of get into the rhythm of it, and the more you say yes, the less you can say no.
Yeah.
And people get used to it. When people respect your boundaries, they can be your friends, because this is an industry where everyone is passionate and they really want to make the best possible work of art. I I really don't agree with people saying, "Oh my God, devs are lazy and devs have an agenda or whatever." They just want to make a great game, and they want to do it while retaining their mental health and social lives.
What is next for you? I know you obviously you can't talk about whatever projects you're working on currently, but long term in your career as a composer, what kind of projects do you want to be working on? What do you want to do? And how are you setting yourself up for that right now?
That's a very interesting question in my case, because it seems that I've hit this is my Chants of Sennaar is my second ever game score. It's the first actually, developed score. Previous one was 15 minutes long. So this is essentially my first.
And how many minutes was Chants?
82. It feels like I've hit the bullseye, because obviously if they hired me, it was because all the music they heard corresponded to their needs, which were many. And obviously for me, it was like the perfect example of something that would probably not happen again, because I'm really passionate about traditional music from all around the world. I've been teaching Brazilian percussion. I've been learning about African music, about music from my country, specifically traditional music. This is something I really wish to explore, and you can never explore it 100%. It's too rich. And then, first big project, you get to write like 5 different musical universes like this with traditional instruments, with perfect clients, it would seem. All of a sudden you're like, can it only go down from there? So I think I want to keep doing new things, and I'm very fortunate to be able to do it with the next project I'm doing right now, which I can't talk about, obviously. But it's something very different from Chants of Sennaar, and I couldn't be happier, and I'm very grateful that I get to do something so different, because I think as artists we have this tendency to fall into patterns, I guess. But it's one of my great fears that I write something and I'm like, how is this different from this other project I did, and how did I personally progress? So I'm very happy with the project I'm working on right now. I have 2 other games coming up in the next months or years. So I'm really happy about this. Most importantly, I would hate to be, stuck in the same styles forever or same methods. I'd like to do things differently. Maybe, one of my big dreams would be to assemble a team of musicians and just to lock ourselves up in a studio for 2 weeks and bang on stuff and find
what's the percussionist in you.
What can I say? And just improvise and collectively find something that people would say, I never quite heard something like this before. And that would be my dream project. Yeah. Amazing. Just to live on pizza and beers in the studio.
I want a music recommendation and a game recommendation off the top of your head.
Okay. The soundtrack from a small French game called En Garde, which is a fencing game. And there's, I can't remember the composer's name. I have to look it up real quick. He did this incredible flamenco fusion soundtrack. Incredible. I haven't seen it in award shows this year, or it's from 23. Jean-Claude Charlier. The game's called En Garde with the exclamation point. And the soundtrack is on YouTube.
Okay.
And this one is, you want to listen to this one.
What's so cool about it?
It is so rich and explosive, and you can listen to it 20 times and find 20 different things that you haven't heard before. The orchestration is so well made, and the mixing and everything. I don't know. I find it really fascinating. Also because I would be utterly incapable of writing something like this. So that might be why.
Cool.
But it's brilliant.
And what's the other piece?
The other piece would be from The Witcher 3, which is the game that don't need more people talking about it, but it's one of these. In the few interviews I gave, I didn't talk about The Witcher 3 and how it influenced me, which is a grave mistake, which I am preparing today. It did really strike me. This is an area that I didn't really explore musically, Eastern Europe just a little bit, but then the whole Slavic part of the continent and the culture around this. And obviously Witcher 3 is one of the games that represent it so well because it has all this literary material behind it, and the music is extraordinary. And that's what they did, what I just said. They went into a studio with a band called Percival Schuttenbach, which is the name of the character in the books. And they just not banged, but strummed and bowed on stuff. And they just wrote incredible music. I think there were two composers, Polish composers, if I'm not mistaken. The band couldn't read sheet music, and they still did something that I haven't heard anything like it before or since, especially the string sounds. Totally hypnotized me. We're talking about the pure sound of the violin. This is not it. This is like the grittiest possible sound you could get from I don't know what it is. Probably some kind of viola da gamba or something.
Right.
In the vicinity of that. But yeah, it really shaped the way I wanted parts of my writing to sound like. The more somber parts, let's say, are very heavily influenced by The Witcher 3. At least the traditional part of the score. A game that I played, don't really.
I know it can be hard as an adult to actually have time to sit down and play games.
Yeah, this is the curse of our profession.
Oh yeah, one of my main pitches for when we started was we just don't have time to play games anymore. So if we don't do it for work, it's just not gonna happen.
Yes, let's make it our job. Yes. And Baldur's Gate 3 just ate 100 hours of my time.
I know. I'm 130 hours in and I only just got to Act 3.
Yeah, I don't regret anything.
What class are you playing, by the way? I have to know.
Warrior. But I need to do a run with Bard.
I was gonna say.
Musicians have to play Bard, and the Dark Urge Bard at that. I've played Baldur's Gate 3, I've played Stray Gods. Stray Gods, maybe, although it is a big game, but I feel I expected it to totally explode, but that might be my very biased way of considering anything Austin Wintory works on is unattainable and it should be venerated as such. But I think it could have had a lot more publicity, I guess. That might just be me, but anyway, yeah. It's incredible. I haven't finished it yet because I really want to take the time to not study, but when you look at how complex the music is in this game and how it evolves, it follows your choices. I don't know if you're familiar with the Stray Gods.
No.
It is a video game musical, which means you're playing characters that are singing, and you decide how their personalities will evolve, and you have like 4 different paths to take.
And you can mix and match. Something we should be interested in.
And every decision changes the music and the lyrics, and obviously the story. And this is like, when I saw that, I was like, who apart from Austin Wintory could stuff like that? It's incredible. I think he did a lot of behind the scenes, and I think it's 90 something sessions. I'm guessing a huge chunk of the budget went into music, which for a musical makes sense.
It makes sense.
And it's amazing. I would advise anyone to play it. Yeah, that's my pick.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has just been Likewise. Everything we could have wanted and more. I'm glad. I've had a blast too, and if I could do anything else, if you want to chat at another point in time or speak about something else, you just
incredible.
Let me know.
Merci beaucoup.
What a fun interview that was. I learned so much about music and video games that I really didn't expect to know.
Thank you again, Mr. Brunet, for hanging out with us. That was so much fun. What's next for the Audiophiles?
Pretty sure we're doing Forza Horizon next.
Forza Horizon 5. That's going to be fun because we're going to get to dive into licensed music in games.
Yep, the unscratched itch of our channel so far.
The Audiophiles is a movement of people dedicated to elevating the stature of video game music.
And we're really, really excited to have your support. And until next time, play
with sound.